He hit her in the hallway, in front of the maid. Not a shove, not a grab. An open-handed strike across the face that snapped her head sideways and sent her shoulder into the wallpaper. The expensive wallpaper, the kind Charles had selected himself from a catalog he'd had imported from London. And for a moment the only sound in the Whitmore estate was the ring of it. The maid, a woman named Dora, who had worked in that house for 11 years, went very still. She did not look up. She had learned not to look up. Charles straightened his cufflink. "You will be at dinner," he said. "You will smile, and you will not mention the Aldridge account again. Do you understand me, Evelyn?" Evelyn's ears were ringing. She could taste copper at the corner of her mouth. She nodded. He walked away down the corridor without another word, his footsteps unhurried, the way a man walks through a house that belongs entirely to him. Dora finally looked up, just for a second, and what passed between the two women in that half-second was not pity, it was recognition. The kind that doesn't need words because words would only make it worse. That was the night Evelyn Hart decided she was going to disappear. If you've ever had to smile at a table while something inside you was bleeding, this story is for you. Stay with us until the end, because what Evelyn does next will surprise you. And if this is the kind of story that moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The house had been built to impress, and it did. 3 stories of pale stone on the edge of Cincinnati, with iron gates at the front and a garden in the back that a crew of 4 men maintained year-round. When Evelyn Marsh had first seen it, 22 years old, nervous, wearing her best dress, she had thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever stood in front of. That was 8 years ago. Now she knew every crack in the ceiling of the east bedroom because she had spent a great deal of time staring at it. She knew which floorboards creaked in the upstairs hallway and which ones didn't because she had learned to move quietly. She knew that the lock on the study door was the heaviest in the house because Charles kept it locked whenever he was not inside, and she had never once been given a key. She had not always been afraid of him. That was the part nobody would believe if she ever tried to tell it. That there had been a time, real, not imagined, when Charles Vane had seemed like exactly the kind of man a young woman from a modest family ought to be grateful for. He was 15 years older than her, successful, well-connected, impeccably mannered in company. Her mother had called him a gift. Her father, who was struggling with debt he would never speak of plainly, had shaken Charles's hand with both of his own. The courtship had been short and deliberate. Charles was not a man who wasted time on uncertainty. He had decided he wanted Evelyn, and so he had pursued her with the focused efficiency he applied to everything. Gifts that were chosen with genuine taste, invitations to events that were just exclusive enough to feel like privilege, conversations that were smart and probing and made her feel, for the first time in her life, that she was interesting. She had mistaken being studied for being loved. The wedding was large and beautiful. Her dress cost more than her father earned in 6 months. She remembered standing at the back of the church, holding her father's arm and thinking, actually thinking, in those exact words, "I am the luckiest woman in this room." 8 years is a long time to learn how wrong you were. It had not happened all at once. She understood that now, in the way you understand things that have already hurt you. It had been gradual, almost architectural, one small restriction placed on top of another until the structure of her life was something she hadn't designed and couldn't recognize. First, it was the friends she saw less of, because Charles found them tiresome, or because the timing was never convenient, or because he preferred quiet evenings at home. Then it was the household decisions that passed through him, not because he insisted exactly, but because he always had a better reason for doing things differently. And after enough times being wrong, Evelyn had simply stopped proposing alternatives. Then it was her appearance. Not cruelly at first, just suggestions. Her hair would look better a different way. That color washed her out. A woman in her position ought to dress with more care. And beneath each suggestion was a current she eventually learned to read. You are not sufficient as you are. You require correction. By the time she understood what was happening to her, she was already deep inside it. The first time he hit her was 2 years into their marriage, after a dinner party during which she had, apparently, talked too much to the man seated on her left. She hadn't understood what she had done wrong until he told her, quietly, in the carriage home. and then less quietly once they were inside. She had told herself it would not happen again. It happened again. And again. And slowly, the in-betweens had begun to matter less than the pattern, because the pattern was the point. The point was that she was never quite safe, never quite certain, always slightly off balance. And a woman off balance does not make trouble. She does not ask questions. She does not go looking for doors. That was the design of it. She had taken years to see it clearly. The morning after the hallway, after Charles had gone to his club and Dora had pressed a folded cloth of cold water into her hands without being asked, Evelyn sat at the small writing desk in her bedroom and opened the bottom drawer. Under a stack of letters she no longer read, under a prayer book that had belonged to her mother, there was a folded sheet of paper she had clipped from a newspaper 3 months earlier. She had not known why she clipped it. That was what she told herself. She was not planning anything. She was only keeping it. Honest partnership sought. Rancher in Red Hollow, Colorado Territory, seeks a woman of capable character for marriage and shared work. No false promises. No requirement of beauty or wealth. Only honesty and willingness. Write to C. Dawson, Box 14, Red Hollow, CO. She had read it so many times the paper was soft at the creases. The ad was strange, she had thought when she first found it. Most of the marriage notices in that section were cloaked in the language of transaction. They spoke of suitable women, of good stock, or domestic skill, of what a man required and what he offered in return, as though a wife were a business arrangement to be negotiated and signed. This one was different. It didn't promise anything fine. It promised nothing, actually, except that the man on the other end was not looking for a decoration. She had written back 6 weeks ago. In secret, using paper she bought herself on an errand, mailing it from a post office 3 streets away from any she normally used. His reply had come to a different address. A woman named Harriet, an old acquaintance from her girlhood who asked no questions and left the envelope on her kitchen table without comment. When Evelyn stopped by one afternoon, claiming she was in the neighborhood, Evelyn had read his letter in a tea room 2 blocks away, her hands not entirely steady. Miss Hart, I appreciate your honesty. You didn't tell me much about yourself, which I respect, because I didn't ask for much. I can tell you that Red Hollow is hard, and the land is harder, and anyone who comes here expecting comfort will be disappointed fast. What I can offer is fair treatment, real work, and my word, which I keep. I don't need a woman who is perfect. I need one who is honest and not afraid of effort. If that is you, you are welcome here. C. Dawson. She had folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and sat for a very long time over a cup of tea that went cold. He didn't know about Charles. She hadn't told him. She had written only that she was a woman in Cincinnati seeking a different kind of life, that she had means enough to fund her own travel, and that she was serious. She had not explained what she was running from because she wasn't sure she could do it in a letter without it sounding like desperation, and she was afraid desperation would send him in the other direction. After the hallway, she stopped worrying about how she sounded. She had 3 days while Charles was in Columbus on business. She did not take much. She had thought about this carefully, thought about it for weeks, actually, in the quiet hours when Charles was asleep, and she lay beside him cataloging what she would need and what she could leave behind. The jewelry was his, legally and in practice. She knew better than to take it. Her bank account held a small amount she had accumulated over years of asking for slightly more than she needed for household expenses, and pocketing the difference in a jar she kept inside a winter coat. It was not a lot. It was enough. She packed a bag the morning he left, not frantically. She had made herself slow down because she knew panic was the enemy of clear thinking, and she needed to think clearly. Dresses that were practical and plain. Her mother's brooch, which predated Charles, and which she would have argued was hers to keep if anyone had been there to argue with. A small amount of cash, the train timetable she had memorized, and the letter from C. Dawson in Colorado. She wrote one letter to a lawyer named Aldridge she had met at a dinner party months earlier, the same Aldridge whose name had earned her a strike in the hallway, because she had the instinct, born of long observation, that Charles would eventually do something that required a legal response, and she wanted at least one person who could be reached. She told Dora she was leaving. She had not planned to. She had planned to simply go, quietly, without word, because the fewer people who knew the better. But Dora was in the kitchen when Evelyn came downstairs with her bag. and the woman took one long look at her and set down the pot she was holding. "You going for good?" Dora asked. Evelyn held the bag strap with both hands. "Yes." Dora was quiet for a moment. Then she opened the larder and took out a cloth bundle. "Bread and cold chicken," she said. "Train ride is long." She held it out. Evelyn took it. "If he asks, I'll say I don't know nothing," Dora said, "because I don't." There was nothing more to say. Evelyn nodded once and walked out the back door into the gray morning. The streets of Cincinnati were already moving with early commerce when she made her way to the station. Delivery carts, men in work clothes, the smell of bakeries just beginning their day. Nobody looked at her twice. She was simply a woman walking with a bag, going somewhere, the way women went somewhere every day. She bought her ticket with cash and stood on the platform and did not let herself think about what she was leaving behind, because she had learned that grief, like panic, could be managed later. Later was a luxury. Right now there was only the train and the direction west, and a man she had never met who had written her a letter that said, in plain language, "You are welcome here." The train pulled out of Cincinnati at 7:15 in the morning. Evelyn sat by the window and watched the city give way to countryside and did not cry, even though part of her wanted to, because crying was something she had done a great deal of in that marble house, and she had decided somewhere in the 3 days of packing and planning that she was done with it for a while. She was 30 years old. She had spent 8 years making herself smaller. She thought it was probably time to find out what happened if she stopped. The train ride west was 3 days, with 2 changes and a long layover in St. Louis, where she sat in the station and drank bitter coffee and watched people and tried not to think about what Charles would do when he came home from Columbus to find her gone. She thought about it anyway. He would be furious first, then controlled. Charles was always controlled when control mattered. Fury was a private thing in his world, something for corridors and closed rooms, not for display in front of people whose opinions he needed. He would tell people something. He would have a story. He always had a story. She had begun, in those last months, to document things. Quietly, without drawing attention to it. Dates and what had happened and what he had said, written in small handwriting in the back pages of a housekeeping ledger that she kept in a drawer he never opened. She had not known, when she started, exactly why she was doing it. It was instinct more than plan. The instinct of a woman who had been told repeatedly that her memory was unreliable, her perception distorted, her sense of things not to be trusted. Writing things down was a way of insisting, privately and stubbornly, that she was not crazy, that she knew what had happened. She had torn those pages out and folded them into the lining of her bag before she left. She didn't know what she would do with them. She only knew she was not leaving them behind. The second train took her through Kansas, flat and vast, and almost nothing to look at, and she stared out the window at it for hours and thought about the advertisement she had answered. She tried to construct a picture of Caleb Dawson from the letter and found she couldn't, not really. He wrote clearly and without flourish, which told her something, that he was either not educated or didn't think education required ornamentation. The content of the letter told her he was direct, not unkind, and realistic about the life he was offering. He had not tried to make it sound better than it was. She found that reassuring in a way she would have struggled to explain to anyone who hadn't spent 8 years being told that things were better than they felt. She slept in short intervals, her bag against the window, and woke each time the train slowed at a station with her heart already going before she remembered where she was and why. Old habits. 8 years of listening for footsteps had left her with a body that treated quiet as suspicious. She arrived in Red Hollow on a Thursday afternoon in late September, 2 hours late because of a delay outside of Pueblo that the conductor never fully explained. The town was smaller than she had expected. One main street, a cluster of low buildings, a water tower visible from the platform, and beyond all of it the land, big and brown and indifferent, the mountains far off to the west like furniture someone had left in a corner of the sky. She stood on the platform with her bag and the food bundle Dora had given her, long since empty, and felt the wind come off the plane and thought, this is nothing like Cincinnati. She meant it as a comfort. A man was standing at the far end of the platform. He was not what she had imagined, though she couldn't have said clearly what she had imagined. He was tall and lean in the way of men who worked outdoors, with the kind of weathering around the eyes that came from squinting into sun and wind rather than from age. He wore a brown hat that had been useful for a long time. I was holding it in his hands. He saw her looking and did not pretend he hadn't. Mrs. Hart? He had hesitated on the name. She had kept her own surname in the letters, not Vane, because Vane was a name she intended to stop wearing as soon as the law allowed. And she was grateful for the hesitation. It meant he had noticed. Mr. Dawson, she said. He came forward but didn't take her bag. He looked at her face, not the bruise, she had covered it as well as she was able, and then at her eyes, and then he looked at the bag. Is that everything? He asked. Yes. He nodded. No expression she could read. The wagon's out front, he said. Ride's about 40 minutes. She followed him off the platform and into the street. The town watched her in the way of small places, from the edges of vision, from windows, from the unhurried business of men with nothing better to do than take note of who stepped off the westbound train. She felt the weight of it and did not let herself look away from the back of Caleb Dawson's hat. The wagon was old but well kept. He loaded her bag without asking and then waited while she climbed up herself, which she appreciated more than she expected to. Charles had always insisted on handling things, on offering his hand for every step and every threshold, not from courtesy, but from the need to be necessary, to make her feel that she could not manage without his assistance. She had managed fine. Caleb climbed up on his side and took the reins, and they moved out of town without much being said. The land opened up around them. The road was more suggestion than road. The sky was large and clear and going gold at the edges as the afternoon wound down. After a while he spoke. You didn't say much in your letters, he said, not accusingly, just noting. No, she said. That's all right. He watched the road. You can say it more later, or not. Doesn't have to be now. She looked at him sideways. He was not looking at her. That's unusual, she said. What is? Most men want the explanation right away. He was quiet for a moment. I figure you'll tell me what I need to know when you decide I need to know it, he said. And if you never decide that, then I didn't need to know it. She sat with that for the rest of the ride. The ranch appeared as the sun was nearly down. A main house that was square and low and built without apology, a barn that was larger than the house, two smaller structures she couldn't identify in the fading light, and fences stretching out in both directions until they disappeared. It was not beautiful in any way she would have previously used that word, but it was solid. It was real. It occupied the land without performing at it. She thought, I could live here. She had not thought she would think that so soon. She had expected it to take longer. Caleb stopped the wagon in front of the house and set the brake and climbed down. He lifted her bag from the back. I'll show you the house, he said. It's not much, but it's clean. She climbed down and followed him to the door, and he pushed it open and went inside without making ceremony of it. And she stood for a moment on the threshold looking at the room beyond, plain and dim and smelling of wood smoke and coffee and something like leather. And then she stepped in. The door swung closed behind her on its spring. She was inside. She was in Colorado. She was in a house belonging to a man she had exchanged 4 letters with, a man who had told her the truth about his life and asked only for honesty in return. She thought about the ledger pages folded in the lining of her bag. She thought about Charles in Columbus, probably finishing his dinner right now, probably charming the men across the table. She thought, he doesn't know where I am. For the first time in 8 years, that thought felt like something she could breathe. Caleb set her bag on a chair by the fireplace. Supper's cold tonight, he said, but there's bread and beans. I didn't know what time you'd get in. Cold is fine, she said. He nodded and moved toward the stove. She stood in the middle of the room and took a long, slow breath. Outside, the wind had come up, and it moved against the walls of the house with a low, steady sound, as though the land were getting acquainted with the idea of her. She thought she could get acquainted with it too. It would not be easy. She knew that. She was not a woman who had ever set a fence post or moved cattle or put up preserves in a kitchen without proper equipment. She was a woman who had run a large household with staff, who had organized dinner parties for 40, who had managed accounts and correspondence and all the invisible infrastructure of a wealthy man's social life. And she had done it, she now understood, while being told by that man that she was incapable of managing anything at all. She was going to learn what she was actually capable of. And somewhere behind her, in a city that was already shrinking in her mind, Charles Vane was going to come home and find a house that was very quiet and a wife who was gone. She almost let herself smile at that. Almost. The cold beans were better than anything Dora had ever served at the Whitmore estate, and Evelyn knew that said less about the beans than it did about who she was eating them with. Caleb sat across from her at a table that was too big for one person and had clearly been built by someone who expected more people at it eventually. He ate without ceremony, elbows on the wood, and didn't seem to notice or care that she was watching him from the corner of her eye, the way a person watches something they're still deciding whether to trust. He refilled her water glass without asking when it got low. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was about practical things. The well had been dug deeper last spring. The barn roof needed attention before the first hard snow. The nearest town with a proper general store was 12 miles north. She found herself listening carefully to all of it. Not because it was interesting exactly, but because it was real, and she had spent so long in rooms full of conversation that was only performance that real things, even boring real things, had a quality she hadn't anticipated. "The outhouse is around the back and to the left," he said. "I know it's not what you're used to." "I'll manage," she said. He looked at her steadily for a moment, not with doubt, but with the particular attention of a man reassessing something he thought he'd already categorized. Then he went back to his beans. After supper, he showed her the room he'd prepared, which was small and plain and had a window that faced east. The bed had a quilt on it that she recognized, in the way a woman recognizes women's work, as something made by careful hands over a long time. She touched the edge of it. "My mother's," he said from the doorway. "She died 4 years ago. I should probably have said that before you touched it." "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He shrugged. Not dismissively, but the way a man shrugs when grief has had 4 years to become something he lives alongside. "She would have liked someone using it," he said. "She didn't approve of things sitting unused." He pulled the door mostly closed as he left, and she stood in the middle of that small room with its east-facing window and its practical quilt and the sound of wind working at the eaves, and she thought about what it meant to be somewhere new. Not safe, exactly. She had enough sense not to call it safe yet, not with the ledger pages still folded in her bag, and the knowledge that Charles Vane was a man who did not accept the word no from anyone. But new. And new, at this particular point in her life, felt like a door opening instead of one swinging shut. She slept harder than she had in years. In the morning, she woke before the sun and lay still for a moment, listening to a house that made completely different sounds than the one she'd left. The Whitmore estate creaked in the language of old money and cold marble. This house spoke plainly. The tick of wood settling, something moving in the barn, the wind still going outside. She could hear Caleb already moving somewhere in the back of the house, the low clatter of something being set on a stove. She got up and dressed, and did not wait to be called. He was in the kitchen when she came in, and he looked at her with mild surprise. Not unpleasant, just the acknowledgement that he had not expected her up yet. He had a fire going in the stove and a pot of coffee on. "I'd like to see the ranch," she said. "All of it, today, if you have time." He poured 2 cups of coffee and handed her one. "I've got things that need doing," he said, "but you can come along while I do them." That was how she spent her first full day at the Dawson Ranch, following Caleb across his land while he worked, and working alongside him when he let her, which was more often than she expected. She held things while he fixed them, carried what needed carrying, and asked questions that she could tell slightly surprised him, not because they were stupid, but because they were the kind of questions that implied she was actually paying attention. The ranch was 320 acres, a little more than half of it currently usable. The cattle herd was smaller than it should be, 41 head, when the land and the infrastructure could have supported close to 120. The reasons for this were layered and, she sensed, sore in the way of things a man doesn't entirely want to explain to someone he's known for less than 24 hours. She didn't push. She filed it away. What she could see clearly, walking it with her own eyes, was that the land was better than the operation suggested. The water source was reliable, a creek that ran year-round along the eastern edge, fed from snowmelt higher up. The pasture, while overgrown in patches, had good grass underneath if it was managed. The soil in a flat section near the south fence was dark and deep. Someone, at some point, had chosen this land with a good eye. What had happened after was a different question. By mid-afternoon, her boots were caked in something she preferred not to think about, and her lower back had developed an opinion about the morning's fence walking, and she was hungrier than she could remember being in recent memory. She had missed the kind of hunger that came from actually doing something. Caleb stopped at a section of fence where two posts were leaning badly and set down the tools he'd been carrying. He didn't look at her, just started working at the first post. "You want to tell me about your face?" he said. She went still. He still didn't look at her. I was working the post, testing its depth. "You covered it pretty well," he said, "but I saw it yesterday, and this morning it's worse because you slept on that side." She had known, in some abstract sense, that this conversation was coming. She had simply hoped for more than a day before it arrived. "My husband," she said, because there was no useful way to say it except plainly. He stopped working. Not dramatically, just stopped, holding the post, and was quiet for a moment. "You know where you are?" he asked. "No." "You gonna look?" "Yes," she said. Eventually, he let out a breath through his nose. Then he went back to working the post. "All right," he said. "All right," she repeated. "All right." He pulled the post and set it to the side and started on the hole. "You're here. Whatever comes next, we'll deal with it when it comes." He glanced at her once, briefly. "You done something that takes nerve, Mrs. Hart. I'm not going to make you explain yourself before the mud on your boots is even dry." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the other tool, a short-handled tamper she'd been watching him use, and held it ready for when he needed it. "Evelyn," she said. He looked at her. "You can call me Evelyn." He considered that. "Caleb," he said, and went back to the post. That evening, she sat at the table after supper and looked at the ranch's account book, which Caleb produced without much comment when she asked to see it. She had expected to find it difficult. She had managed the financial records of a large household for 8 years, secretly, in the margins of what Charles permitted her to do, and she had found she had a facility for numbers that nobody had ever found useful before because nobody had bothered to look. The account book was honest and depressing. The ranch had been profitable 5 years ago, modestly, but real. Then a winter had come that killed a third of the herd, and the recovery had been slow, and 2 subsequent seasons had brought prices low enough that the losses compounded. Caleb had taken a bank loan the previous year to cover operating costs. The interest was eating into what little margin remained. There were other debts, to a feed supplier, to a man named Harlan Briggs, who seemed to have lent money at terms that made her look twice and then 3 times. "Who is Harlan Briggs?" she asked. Caleb was sharpening a knife at the other end of the table. The sound of it paused. "Neighbor," he said. "South parcel, about 200 acres. The interest on this note is 18%. I know it. That's not a neighbor rate. That's a trap." He set the whetstone down. He was quiet in the way of a man who knows something is true and didn't need it confirmed, but who hears it differently coming from someone else's mouth. "How short were you?" she asked. "Short enough that he was the only one offering," he said. She looked back at the book. "When does it come due?" 8 months. She turned a few pages back and forth, tracing the columns with one finger, doing the arithmetic in her head the way she had always done it, quickly and without effort, a habit Charles had always seemed vaguely irritated by, as though a woman who was comfortable with numbers was somehow challenging something he hadn't asked to be challenged on. "You've got enough coming in from the current herd to make the interest, barely. But to pay down the principal, you'd need either a better price on this fall's cattle or an additional income stream before spring." Caleb was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, not suspicious, something more like recalibrating. "You worked with accounts before?" he asked. "I ran a household of 12 staff and managed a budget my husband thought he was managing himself," she said, not with pride, just accurately. He picked up the whetstone again. "What would you do, if it were yours to deal with?" She thought about it seriously, which she could tell he appreciated because he didn't rush her. "2 things immediately," she said. "First, I'd go to the bank in whatever the nearest city is and refinance this Briggs note. Even a bad bank rate is better than 18%. Second, that south section near the creek, the flat part with the dark soil. Has anyone tried growing anything in it?" "No." "Why not?" He paused his sharpening. "Never had the help for it." She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her. Something was being established between them that was neither simple nor finished, but that had the quality of a foundation, something that would hold weight if they let it. She went back to the account book. The first month was the hardest, and she had expected it to be, but the particular shape of the hardness surprised her. It was not emotional, or not only emotional. It was physical in a way she had genuinely not prepared for, and she was annoyed at herself for that, because she was not a woman who liked to be caught underprepared. She developed blisters on her hands in the first week and said nothing about them. She pulled a muscle in her shoulder in the second week, lifting something she should have asked for help with, and said nothing about that either. The cooking she had expected to be difficult was difficult in different ways than she'd imagined, not because she didn't know the theory, but because a wood stove was a different instrument than what she'd ever worked with, and it took her nearly 3 weeks to understand it well enough to produce food that was reliably edible rather than reliably questionable. Caleb ate everything she put in front of him without comment, which she eventually understood was courtesy rather than low standards. "You don't have to do that," she said one evening after she served a stew that had cooked too long and had the texture of something that had given up. "Do what?" he said. "Eat things that aren't good." He chewed thoughtfully. "It's not that bad." "Caleb." He looked at her. "The salt is right," he said. "The rest is just time." She thought that was more diplomatic than she deserved. And she also thought it was exactly the kind of thing a man said when he had decided you were worth patience. She was not used to being worth patience. She found it made her want to do better, which was entirely different from the way Charles had made her want to do better, which was through the certainty that she was always, in some way she hadn't yet identified, doing it wrong. She began getting up at 5. She found that the morning hours, before the full work of the day began, were when she could sit with the account book and think without interruption. She started keeping her own ledger alongside Caleb's, not replacing it, just running her own numbers in parallel, testing ideas, mapping out what-ifs. She had always thought best with a pen in her hand, and here she finally had time to use it. By the end of the first month, she had 3 concrete proposals. She presented them to Caleb on a Sunday evening, because she had intuited that Sunday evenings were when he was least pressed for time and most willing to sit and talk. She laid them out plainly, without preamble, the way she had seen him communicate and had found she preferred. First, the bank refinance. She had written a letter to the First Territorial Bank in Pueblo, outlining the ranch's assets and proposing a consolidation of the Briggs note at a competitive rate. She had written it in a register that was professional and specific and left no room for the bank to talk down to her, which was a skill she had developed over years of managing Charles's correspondence while pretending she wasn't. Second, the South Field. The soil was good. She wanted to put in winter wheat, small scale, a test, to give them a secondary income stream by spring that wasn't entirely dependent on cattle prices. Third, the herd. She had talked to a man in town named Rupert Hale, who ran the feed store and knew everyone's business, and had learned that there was a cattle operation 2 valleys over that had 3 good breeding cows. They were willing to sell below market because they were reducing their herd due to the owner's poor health. Good bloodlines, Rupert had said. Better than anything Caleb currently had. Caleb listened to all of it without interrupting, which she'd also come to understand was his way. He didn't perform attention, he just had it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The letter to the bank," he said. "How'd you know what to write?" "I've read a lot of financial correspondence," she said, "and I've noticed what works." He nodded slowly. "The South Field. I'd need to clear the brush on the east end before planting." "I know. I factored the time in. If we start the clearing next week, there's still a window." He picked up her ledger sheet and looked at it. His expression was not the expression of a man humoring someone. It was the expression of a man genuinely reading something and finding it useful, which was an expression she had almost never seen directed at anything she'd produced. "The cows," he said. "What's the ask?" Rupert said $40 for all 3. "I think you could get them for $35 if you go yourself and don't send a letter first." He put the ledger sheet down. He laced his hands together on the table. "I've been running this place for 9 years," he said, "by myself for the last 4. "I know," she said. I'm not saying you're wrong," he said. "I'm saying I might need a day or 2 to catch up with the fact that you're right." She looked at him across the table. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Something that was not romance, not yet, and not gratitude either, but somewhere between them. Something like recognition, the kind you feel when someone sees you clearly and doesn't look away. "Take whatever time you need," she said. He took 1 day. The next morning he told her he'd ride out to look at the cows that afternoon, and she should write up the bank letter in good copy so he could sign it. She wrote it in good copy. He signed it and mailed it that week. The townspeople of Red Hollow had formed their opinions about Evelyn in the first 2 weeks, and the opinions were not, on the whole, kind. She had expected this and found that expectations didn't make it much more comfortable. The women of the town were polite in the surface way of small communities where everyone knows they will have to keep seeing each other. But politeness and warmth are very different things, and she had enough experience with the former to recognize when the latter was absent. She was a stranger. She was an Eastern woman. She was a mail-order arrangement, which carried its own weight of assumption. The assumption being, she gathered, that a woman who answered an advertisement was either desperate or defective or both. What interested her more than the women was the men. Not personally, she had no interest in the men of Red Hollow personally, but professionally, in the sense that several of them clearly had opinions about her presence at the ranch that went beyond simple social judgment into something more territorial. A man named Fisk Connolly was the most direct about it. I was a heavy-set man who ran a cattle buying operation out of a storefront on the main street and who seemed to have made it his business to know the financial state of every rancher in the valley. He stopped her outside the general store in her 3rd week, in the particular way of a man who has positioned himself to seem accidental. "Mrs. Vane," he said, using the name she hadn't given him, which told her someone had talked. "Miss Hart," she said. He blinked at that. Then he smiled in a way that didn't reach anything. "Of course, I heard you were helping Dawson with his books." "Among other things," she said. "He's in a tough spot financially. You probably know that." He said it with the careful sympathy of a man who finds other people's tough spots professionally convenient. "If he's looking to sell, parcels, or the whole thing, I'd be willing to have a conversation." "I'll let him know," she said, and walked around him. She told Caleb that evening. He listened with the same flat attention he brought to most things. "Connolly's been circling this place for 3 years," he said, "ever since the bad winter." "He's waiting for you to run out of options," she said. "That's generally how it works out here." He looked at her. "You're not going to let that happen, are you?" It wasn't quite a question. "No," she said. "I'm not." The bank letter came back in the 4th week with a conditional approval. They would refinance the Briggs note at 9%, which was still not generous, but was roughly half what Briggs was charging, and the difference over 8 months was significant. Caleb read the letter twice and then handed it to her. "They want you to come in and sign," she said, reading the details. "With a co-signer." He looked at her. "I can come," she said. "You're not on the deed," he said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "But I have my own money. Not much, but enough to put as collateral against the note. It would satisfy what they're asking." I was very still. "That's your money," he said. "That's your way out, if you need one." She met his eyes. "I know what it is," she said. He looked at her for a long time, in the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. Then he said, "We go Tuesday. It's a half-day ride to Pueblo." They rode to Pueblo on Tuesday and sat across a desk from a bank officer named Merritt, who had the manner of a man accustomed to explaining things to people he believed understood less than he did. He directed most of what he said to Caleb. Evelyn let him do that for about 3 minutes, and then she started asking questions, specific questions with specific numbers that made it clear within about 60 seconds that she understood the terms of the note better than Merritt had prepared for. He looked at her with an expression that moved through surprise into something more cautious, and then he addressed the rest of the meeting to both of them. They rode home with a signed agreement in her saddlebag, and the Briggs note effectively closed, and the evening air coming off the mountains had a bite to it that she was beginning, slowly, to recognize as approaching winter. "You did that before," Caleb said, somewhere on the road home. "Sat across from a man who didn't take you seriously and waited for your moment." "Yes," she said. He didn't say anything else, but she caught the small movement at the corner of his mouth that she was learning to read as the closest he came to smiling without actually doing it. She had been at the ranch 6 weeks when the letter arrived. It came to the Red Hollow post office, addressed to her in a hand she would have recognized in a dark room. Charles's handwriting was as controlled and precise as everything else about him, and it looked out of place on an envelope with a Colorado postmark, like something expensive that had gotten wet. The postmaster, a man named Deese, who regarded the mail as a semi-public document, handed it to her with the particular quality of attention that meant he had already noticed the Cincinnati return address. She took it without comment and put it in her coat pocket and walked out. She did not open it until she was home, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that she held in both hands, because the morning was cold and her hands were always cold now from working outdoors. The letter was 2 pages. She had expected rage, because Charles's letters, and the private ones, had always eventually become rage. But this letter was something else. It was calm and constructed and specific, which was worse. It said that he was concerned for her welfare. It said that she had clearly not been herself, that she had acted in distress, that he understood she had been through a difficult time, and that he did not hold her responsible for the decisions she had made in that state. It said that he was prepared to be generous, that he had engaged a lawyer, that the doors of the Whitmore estate remained open to her, and that he would be grieved to see her current confusion become a matter of public record. Current confusion. She read that phrase twice. She set the letter on the table and looked at it. Then she went to her bag and took out the folded ledger pages, the dates and the incidents and the things he had said and done, in her small, precise handwriting, and she laid them next to the letter. Caleb came in from the barn and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She slid the letter across the table to him without speaking. He read it standing up, still in his coat, still carrying the smell of horses and cold air. His face didn't change much, but his jaw tightened once, briefly, in the way of a man who is deciding what to do with a feeling before it has a chance to make decisions for him. He put the letter down. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up again, and the first dry edge of winter was in it, and the wheat she'd planted in the south field was 2 inches high and holding on against the cold with the stubborn insistence of things that don't know they're supposed to give up. "I want to write to the lawyer I contacted in Cincinnati before I left," she said, "and I want to find out what my legal position actually is." "And if he comes here?" Caleb said. He said it neutrally, not with fear, just because it was the next logical question. She looked at the letter. She looked at her ledger pages. She thought about the woman who had stood in a hallway with her ears ringing, nodding at a man who had just hit her because she had learned that nodding was safer than anything else. "He'll find someone different than the woman he remembers," she said. Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he took off his coat and hung it on the peg by the door and moved toward the stove. "Coffee's cold," he said. "I'll heat it up." She pulled her ledger pages back toward her and straightened the stack and held them flat under one hand, the way you hold things you need to keep. Outside, the wheat was still there. The lawyer's name was Edmund Aldridge, and he wrote back in 10 days, which was faster than she had expected and slow enough that she had spent the intervening time learning not to watch the post office door every time she was in town. His letter was careful and precise, in the way of a man who chose his words with the understanding that letters could be read by people other than their intended recipients. He confirmed that he had received her original letter from Cincinnati, that he had retained it in confidence, and that he had, acting on his own professional judgment after she left, begun making certain inquiries. He did not specify what inquiries. He said he would need more time. He said she should not respond to Charles directly, and under no circumstances should she return to Cincinnati voluntarily. That last line she read 3 times. Under no circumstances. Aldridge was not a man who used strong language casually. She had met him once at a dinner party, had spent 40 minutes talking to him in a corner while Charles held court across the room, and had recognized in him the quality of a man who said less than he knew and knew considerably more than he said. The fact that he was telling her not to go back meant he had found something, or suspected something, that made going back dangerous in a way that went beyond Charles's temper. She wrote back the same afternoon, giving him the ranch's address and a careful description of the letter Charles had sent, not copying it out because she didn't want to put that language in her own hand, but summarizing its content and its tone. She included one of the ledger pages as well, not all of them. 1. Covering a period of 3 months, 2 years into the marriage, with dates and specifics that were unambiguous. She folded it inside the letter the way you fold something fragile, because in a sense it was evidence of a version of her life she had spent considerable effort surviving, and putting it in an envelope felt like sending a piece of herself somewhere she couldn't follow. She sealed it and mailed it herself. The winter wheat in the south field had come up stronger than she'd allowed herself to hope. She checked it every morning on her way to the barn, which was a habit she had developed without deciding to, the way you develop habits around things you've invested in. Not just money and labor, but the particular kind of attention that means you've staked something of yourself on an outcome. The plants were small and unremarkable to look at, pale green shoots in dark soil, but they were there, and they were holding. And on mornings when the frost was hard, she would crouch and press one finger against the soil near the base of a plant to feel if the ground was still workable beneath the surface. Caleb noticed but didn't comment on the morning ritual until the third week, when he came up beside her one morning and stood there looking at the field with his coffee in his hand. "They're doing well," he said. "Better than I expected," she said. "The soil holds heat better than I thought. We might get a decent yield." He nodded. "Rupert says the feed store in Pueblo has been buying local grain when it's available. Better margin than the cattlemen's cooperative." She looked at him. He was still looking at the field. "You talked to Rupert about this?" "You did all the thinking," he said. "I figured I could do the asking around." She stood up from her crouch and looked at the field alongside him. The morning was gray and cold, and the mountains in the west were white above the timberline, and the south field was pale green and quiet and alive. It was the first thing she had grown. She thought that was probably significant, though she didn't say so. The trouble with Harlan Briggs arrived not by letter, but in person, on a Tuesday morning in November, when the temperature had dropped hard overnight and the ground was iron, and Evelyn was in the barn working on a piece of harness that had cracked at a buckle. She heard the horse before she saw the man, and she came to the barn door to look. He was a wide man on a big horse, not tall, but built with the solid heaviness of someone who had spent 40 years making himself difficult to move. He wore a good coat and a bad expression, and he was looking at the house rather than the barn, which told her he hadn't seen her yet. She stepped out. He turned at the movement and looked at her with the frank assessment of a man who categorizes women quickly and doesn't expect to revise the categorization. "Dawson here?" he said. "He's at the north fence," she said. Can I help you?" "I doubt it," he said. He swung off the horse with the ease of a man who'd done it 10,000 times. "I'm Briggs, Harlan Briggs." She had known that before he said it. She'd been building a picture of him for 2 months from the account book, and from things Caleb said at the edges of other conversations, and from the way Rupert Hale went quiet whenever the name came up. The picture she'd built was accurate in all the ways that mattered. "Mr. Briggs," she said, "Evelyn Hart. I'm helping Mr. Dawson manage the ranch accounts." Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly, but the recalibration of a man who had come prepared for one situation and was finding another. "The new wife," he said. "Associate," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man deciding whether to bother. Then he looked back at the house. "I'll wait for Dawson." "You can wait inside," she said. "It's cold." She didn't particularly want him inside, but she was not going to stand in a cold barnyard trading social unpleasantness with a man who had lent Caleb money at 18% with the specific intention of acquiring this property when the note came due. She knew that the way she knew things she had reasoned out from evidence. She had no proof yet, but proof was a matter of time and patience, and she had been developing both. She put him at the kitchen table with coffee, because refusing hospitality told people what you knew before you were ready for them to know you knew it, and she went back to the barn and sent the ranch hand, a boy named Pete, who was 16 and did his work without complaint, and had so far observed Evelyn's presence at the ranch with the cautious bewilderment of someone encountering a species he hadn't known existed. She sent Pete to find Caleb at the north fence. Then she came back inside and sat down across from Briggs with her own coffee. He had not expected that. "I'll wait for Dawson," he said again. "He'll be 15 minutes, she said. "Drink your coffee." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. The fire ticked in the stove. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves. "You looked at the note," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did," she said. "Then you know what it says." "I know what it said," she said. "We refinanced it with First Territorial in October. The Briggs note is closed." He went very still. It was the stillness of a man who has had something taken from him and is deciding, in real time, how to respond to that. She had expected anger. What she got was something colder, a quality of attention that was more like assessment than emotion, the kind a man turns on something he's revising his plans around. "Closed," he said. "Signed and recorded," she said. "If you need a copy of the satisfaction, Mr. Aldridge in Cincinnati can provide confirmation." She had added that last part deliberately and watched his face to see if Aldridge's name meant anything. It didn't seem to, which meant Briggs and Charles were not connected, which was worth knowing. Caleb came in then, still carrying the cold of the North Field, and looked between the two of them with an expression that read the room accurately. "Harlan," he said. "Dawson." Briggs stood up. He was controlled now, the brief stillness resolved into something smooth and social. "Just came to check on things. Heard you had some changes out here." "A few," Caleb said. He poured himself coffee at the stove and leaned against the counter in the particular way of a man who is being careful not to lean too far in any one direction. Briggs put on his coat. "The note being closed," he said. "That was fast work." "We try to be organized," Caleb said. Briggs looked at Evelyn once more. It was the look of a man filing something away. "You let me know if you need anything," he said. "I've always been a friend of this ranch." "I know you have," Caleb said. Briggs went out. They listened to his horse leaving without saying anything to each other. When the sound was gone, Caleb set his coffee down. "How'd he take it?" he asked. "Quietly," she said, "which I think means he's adjusting, not giving up." Caleb nodded. "He's been wanting this land since before the bad winter. The creek's the reason. His south parcel runs dry in summer, and he knows my creek doesn't." She looked at him. "Does anyone else know that? About the creek?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, if the creek is the valuable thing, and he wants the property, and he's patient." She stopped, because she was thinking faster than she was speaking, and she needed to catch up with herself. "Has he ever done anything to interfere with access? With water?" Caleb was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something was landing differently than it had before. "There was a season 2 years ago when the creek ran lower than normal. I figured it was drought." "Was it a drought year?" "Not particularly," he said slowly. She looked at the table. She was thinking about Aldridge and evidence and the difference between suspecting something and being able to prove it. She was thinking about the ledger pages in her bag and what it felt like to write things down for years before they became useful. "I want to look at the creek," she said, "the whole length of it, from where it comes onto the property." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. They rode the creek line the following Saturday, all 4 miles of it from where it crossed onto the Dawson property at the north boundary to where it turned east near the old cottonwoods at the south end. The day was cold and clear, and the mountains stood out against the sky with the hard precision of things that don't negotiate. Caleb rode ahead where the ground was uncertain, and she rode behind, and they didn't talk much because the landscape required attention. At a point about a mile inside the north boundary, she found it. It wasn't dramatic. That was what made it easy to miss. It wasn't a dam or a diversion or anything that announced itself as deliberate. It was a channel. Dug, she thought, probably over 2 or 3 winters, and partially obscured by the growth that had moved in around it. A slow pull, taking maybe a quarter of the creek's flow, redirecting it north along a slight grade toward a dry wash that ran in the direction of Briggs's property. She got off her horse and crouched beside it and looked at the cut edges of the channel where the seasons hadn't yet softened them completely. The shovel marks were still visible if you knew what you were looking for. Caleb came up behind her and stood for a moment. "I'll be damned," he said quietly. "You'll want to have someone look at this who can speak to it officially," she said. "A surveyor or a county water officer, before it's repaired, not after." He crouched beside her. He was looking at the channel with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not rage, but something close to it underneath something that was trying to stay level. "That's why the south pasture grass went thin," he said, 2 years ago. "The cattle were going to the south end because the water was better down there, and I thought they were just ranging, but the north pasture was drier. And drier pasture grows thinner grass and feeds fewer cattle," she said, "which means lower yield, which means tighter margins, which means the loan from Briggs looks more necessary." He stood up. He looked north along the creek toward where it crossed into his property, and she could see him doing what she had done. Reconstructing the sequence, understanding it not as bad luck or drought or market forces, but as design. Someone else's design, patient and incremental, the kind that worked because it was invisible. She knew that feeling. She had lived inside that feeling for 8 years. "We get a surveyor out here," she said. "We document this. Every measurement, every photograph we can manage, the date, the condition. We don't touch it first. If I'd found this on my own, I'd have filled it in already," he said. "I know," she said. That's the other reason it works. It makes you want to fix it, not record it. He looked at her. The winter light was flat and the creek moved beside them with the indifference of water that goes where it's directed, and she could see him working through it, the anger and the recalibration and the particular grinding adjustment of realizing that a problem you thought was circumstance is actually a person. "I'm sorry," she said, because she meant it, not as a formula. He shook his head once. "Don't be," he said. "I'd rather know." The county surveyor came out the following week. His name was Art Fenwick, a lean man in his 50s who had been mapping this territory for 20 years and who looked at the channel with the careful attention of a professional and the compressed outrage of a man who had seen too many things done to good land that shouldn't have been done to it. He took measurements. He made drawings. He wrote things in a notebook with a thoroughness that Evelyn found genuinely comforting because thoroughness was what stood between a suspicion and a fact. "This is recent work," he told them, crouching beside the channel in a way that reminded Evelyn of herself 2 weeks earlier. 3, maybe 4 years. Done in stages, I'd guess. Little at a time, so it doesn't announce itself. "Can you put that in a report?" she asked. He looked at her. "I can put what I observe in a report," he said. "I can't tell you who dug it." "I'm not asking you to," she said. "I'm asking you to tell me what you see and when it was done and what effect it would have on downstream flow." He looked at her for another moment. "You know your business," he said, not unkindly, somewhere between surprised and approving. "I'm learning it," she said. The surveyor's report came back in 12 days. It was precise and detailed and used language that was carefully neutral in the way of official documents, but which, if you knew how to read it, said clearly that someone had deliberately redirected water that did not belong to them. Evelyn read it through twice, made her own notes in the margins of her copy, and then wrote to Aldridge again. A longer letter this time, enclosing the surveyor's report and a summary of what they had found and what she believed it implied about Briggs's larger intentions. She was beginning to understand that whatever Aldridge was building in Cincinnati and whatever she was building in Colorado might eventually need to connect. She wasn't sure yet how. She only knew that evidence accumulated and that the person who kept the best record had the strongest foundation when things finally came to a head, and things were going to come to a head. That was the nature of patient designs when they were finally exposed. Charles's second letter arrived 2 weeks after the first, and this one was different. The careful, constructed concern of the first letter was gone. In its place was something that was still controlled on the surface. Charles was always controlled on the surface. But that had a quality underneath it she recognized the way you recognize weather. The language was precise and cold, and full of the particular vocabulary of a man who has decided that sympathy isn't producing the desired result and is moving to the next tool in his kit. He said he had spoken to a lawyer who specialized in cases of mental incapacity and marital abandonment. He said the courts in Ohio had begun to take an interest in the matter. He said that her association with an unknown individual in the territories was a matter of significant concern for her welfare and for the reputation of the Vane family. He said he would be in Colorado by spring. She put the letter on the table. He would be in Colorado by spring. She had known this was coming, had known it the way you know a storm is coming. Not the exact day, not the exact form, but the certainty of it, the air pressure changing. She had been preparing for it without letting herself think too directly about what preparation meant, because thinking about it too directly made her hands do things she didn't want them to do. She told Caleb at supper. He ate for a moment after she stopped talking. "You knew he'd come," he said. "Yes." "What's the play?" he asked. He had started saying that, "What's the play?" in the last few weeks when they were working through a problem, and she had noticed it and not said anything about it because it was the kind of thing you noticed and held carefully. "I need to know what my legal standing actually is," she said, "in Colorado territory. I need to know whether an Ohio court has jurisdiction here and what he can actually do versus what he's threatening to do." "I know a man in Pueblo," Caleb said, "lawyer named Crane. He's handled land disputes mostly, but he's sharp and he knows this territory's law. Can you arrange a meeting? I'll ride out this week." She looked at her coffee cup. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "If he comes here with lawyers and money and the story he told in that letter, the story about me being unstable, confused, coerced, some people in this town will believe it," she said. "Not everyone, but enough. He's very good at the story. She paused. He's had 8 years of practice with it. Caleb was quiet. She could see him thinking it through, not dismissing it, not rushing to reassure her it wouldn't happen, because he understood her well enough by now to know that false reassurance was something she had no use for. "What do you want to do about it?" he said. "I want to tell the truth first," she said, "before he gets here with his version." "To who?" She thought about it. "Ruth Ellery," she said. Ruth Ellery ran the dry goods store on the main street of Red Hollow and was, in Evelyn's careful assessment, the social axis around which the town's information moved. Not a gossip in the malicious sense, a connector, the kind of person who knew everything not because she sought it out, but because people came to her, and what she knew shaped how the community understood things. Evelyn had been cultivating the relationship carefully for 2 months, in the way she had always cultivated relationships, slowly, with genuine interest, without asking for anything until she understood what she was asking and why. Caleb looked at her. "You want to get ahead of him." "I want people to have heard my voice before they hear his," she said. "He controls rooms, he controls stories. It's his most reliable skill. If the room is already formed when he walks into it, it's harder." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "That's a smart play," he said. "It's also a risk." "I know. Once you put the story out there, you can't take it back." "I know that too." She looked at him directly. "I've been careful for 8 years. I've been quiet. I've managed and minimized and worked around the edges of things I should have been walking through the middle of. I'm done with that." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, just once, the way he nodded when he had made a decision about something. She went to Ruth Ellery the next morning. She had thought, on the ride to town, about how to say it. She had thought about what to leave in and what to leave out, and in what order to present things so that they were comprehensible and honest without becoming the kind of story that people felt sorry for rather than respected. She did not want to be a woman people pitied. She had enough experience with that. She sat in the back of the dry goods store on a stool that Ruth kept there for conversations, and Ruth sat on the other stool, and Evelyn told her. Not everything, the shape of it, enough. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of intelligence. Her face moved through several expressions, but she kept them under control. And when Evelyn finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He's coming here," Ruth said. "He said spring." Ruth looked at her hands in her lap. "The bruise," she said. "When you first came in that October, I saw it. I didn't say anything." "I didn't expect you to," Evelyn said. "I barely knew you." "I knew you enough," Ruth said. There was something in her voice that was private and compressed and not entirely about Evelyn, and Evelyn didn't push it. "I'm not asking you to do anything," Evelyn said. "I'm asking you to know." Ruth looked at her. "You want me to know before he gets here?" "Yes. And if he comes with his lawyers and his money and his story about the confused wife who ran off to the frontier." "You'll have heard another version," Evelyn said. Ruth nodded slowly. "My husband's cousin is a county judge in Pueblo," she said, which was not what Evelyn had expected her to say. "I'm not promising anything. I'm just telling you." Evelyn held that for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Ruth said. "Thank me if it matters." On the ride home, the winter came down properly for the first time. Not a heavy snow, but the first real fall, the kind that meant it. She rode through it with her coat pulled up and her head down, and she thought about spring and what it would bring and what she needed to have in place before it arrived. The wheat in the south field, the surveyor's report, the letters to Aldridge, the refinanced note, the relationship with Ruth, the lawyer Crane in Pueblo, who she would meet on Thursday. These were not weapons, exactly. They were not even plans, not fully. They were the things she had always been good at and had spent 8 years pretending she wasn't. The slow, patient accumulation of things that were true, set down in order, held ready. Charles was coming with money and lawyers and a story he had been polishing for months. She was going to meet him with something he had never once thought she was capable of. The evidence of who she actually was. Snow fell through the afternoon, and by the time she rode back into the ranch yard, it had covered the south field in a thin white sheet, and beneath it, she knew, the wheat was still there, roots deep in the dark soil, waiting with the particular patience of things that know they have more time than the season suggests. Pete took her horse without being asked, and she went inside and started a fire and put water on, and stood at the window looking at the white field while the stove ticked behind her. She was not afraid. That was the thing she kept coming back to, testing it the way you test ice before you put your weight on it. She had expected to be afraid, expected it the way she had expected the blisters and the pulled muscle and the wood stove's stubbornness as a reasonable cost of the life she was choosing. But standing at the window looking at her snow-covered field with Charles Vane's letter on the table behind her, what she felt was not fear. It was something older and quieter and considerably more dangerous. It was readiness. The lawyer. Crane turned out to be a small man who occupied a large chair behind a desk that had seen considerable use, and he had the habit of listening with his eyes half closed that Evelyn had initially mistaken for disinterest and quickly revised to its opposite. She laid out the situation without editorializing. The marriage, the Ohio domicile, Charles's letters and their language, the claim of mental incapacity, the threat of legal action. She put Aldridge's letter on the desk and the surveyor's report beside it because she had brought everything, understanding that a lawyer needed the full landscape and not the version that made her look best. Crane read without speaking. He picked up the surveyor's report and set it back down. He picked up Aldridge's letter and spent longer with it. "Aldridge is a good man," he said finally. "If he's telling you not to return voluntarily, he means it." "What's my position here?" she asked. "In Colorado territory. Can an Ohio court compel me to return?" Crane laced his fingers together on the desk. "Jurisdiction is complicated at the territorial level. Ohio can issue orders. Whether those orders have teeth out here depends considerably on what your husband's lawyers choose to argue and what judge they find to argue it in front of." He paused. "If they argue abandonment, and he's the aggrieved party, and you have no documentation of the circumstances—" "I have documentation," she said. She put the folded ledger pages on the desk. He unfolded them and read. His expression didn't change much, but his jaw moved once in the way of a man swallowing something he finds distasteful. "These are your own records," he said. "Written at the time," she said. "Dates and incidents. I kept them for 3 years. Any witnesses?" "A servant named Dora. I don't know her full name or where she'd be now. And there was a doctor, twice, in year 3 and year 5. I went for a shoulder and a rib, respectively. Charles told people I was clumsy. The doctor's name was Guerin, on Prospect Street in Cincinnati. She had written that name down specifically before the meeting because she had known it would be asked. Crane looked at her over the pages. "You came prepared," he said. "I've been prepared for this conversation for 2 years," she said. "I didn't know who I'd be having it with." He set the pages down carefully. "Here's what I can tell you. If your husband files in Ohio, there will be a lag before it reaches us out here. That lag is your preparation time. You'll want Aldridge moving on your behalf in Ohio, filing first if possible, so you're the petitioner and not the respondent." He looked at Caleb. "Your situation here matters. You're not legally married, which cuts both ways. She has no formal protection under your name, but she also has no additional obligation to him that marriage in Colorado would create." "What about the water diversion?" Caleb said. "Is that a separate matter?" "Completely separate. That's a territorial property dispute and it stays here." Crane looked between them. "But if Vane comes here and finds you entangled in a property dispute with a local party, he'll use it. His lawyers will use anything that makes her situation look unstable or disreputable." "Briggs and Charles don't know each other," Evelyn said. "I checked." Crane raised one eyebrow slightly. "You checked?" "I mentioned Aldridge's name to Briggs when he visited. No reaction. They're separate problems." "Separate problems can still be used together if someone's building a picture," Crane said. "Keep them separate in your own handling. Don't let them become the same story." He picked up a pen. "I'm going to need dates. The marriage date, the departure date. Any specific incidents from your ledger that had witnesses, even incidental ones. And I need Aldridge's full name and address because I intend to write to him this week." She pulled out the summary sheet she had prepared before the meeting and slid it across the desk. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "Have you done legal work before?" "No," she said. "I've just been paying attention." The ride back from Pueblo was long and cold, and they didn't talk much for the first hour, which was normal for them now. They had developed the kind of ease that doesn't need to fill silence. Caleb rode with his hat pulled low against the wind coming off the plain, and Evelyn rode beside him and thought about timelines. "Spring," Charles had said. That was 3 months, maybe 4. Crane and Aldridge needed to exchange letters and coordinate strategy, and legal letters moved slower than the events they were trying to address. The wheat needed to come in before late May to be worth anything at market. The water dispute needed to be formally filed with the County Water Authority before Briggs did anything to obscure the evidence. She intended to push on that this week. 3 months, maybe 4, and a great deal needed to happen inside that window. "You're doing the thing," Caleb said. She looked at him. "What thing?" "Where you go quiet, but your whole face is loud," he said. She hadn't known she did that. "I'm making a list," she said. "In your head." "I think better that way." "Tell me what's on it," he said. "You might have missed something," she told him. He listened without interrupting, which was still one of his most useful qualities, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The water filing," he said. "I want to go to the county authority before we file. There's a man there. His name's Orrin Webb. Been there 15 years. If he sees the surveyor's report before we file formally, it'll carry more weight when it's recorded." "You know him?" "We went to school together," Caleb said. "I haven't seen him in 8 years, and I owe him an apology for something that doesn't matter anymore, but he's honest and he knows this valley's water history better than anyone." She looked at him. "You owe him an apology." "I said something stupid when we were 17, he said. "It was a long time ago, and I'd rather deal with it than not deal with it." She found that unexpectedly moving, though she didn't say so. "All right," she said. "We see Webb first." They rode the rest of the way home in the growing dark with the wind at their backs for once, pushing them east, and she thought about Caleb saying, "Your whole face is loud," and turned it over in her mind, the way you turn over something small and useful, examining it from different angles. Charles had never once described her face as anything other than a liability or an asset depending on the occasion. The idea that her face communicated something worth paying attention to, something she was doing rather than something that was done to her, was the kind of thought that arrived small and landed heavier than expected. Orrin Webb received them at the County Water Authority office on a Thursday, in a room that smelled of old paper and lamp oil and the particular must of documents that hadn't moved in years. I was a spare man with a handshake that meant what it was supposed to mean, and when Caleb said the thing he'd been carrying for 20 years, quietly, without drama, just, "I said something to you in 1858 that I shouldn't have, and I'm sorry for it." Webb looked at him for a moment and then said, "I forgot about that years ago," which was probably not entirely true but was the right thing to say, and the thing that came after it was cleaner than what had been there before. Webb looked at the surveyor's report with the attention of a man who understood water in a practical, personal way. He asked questions about the creek's historical flow, about the years Caleb had noticed changes, about the channel's construction and how far from the boundary line it sat. "This is inside your property line," he said, pointing to the channel location on the surveyor's map. "Yes," Evelyn said, "by about 60 yards. "Then whoever dug it crossed onto your property to do it." He set the report down. "That's trespass at minimum. At maximum, it's water theft under the territorial statute from 71. He looked at Caleb. "You want a file?" "We want a file," Caleb said. Webb nodded. "I'll need to come out and see it myself before it's formally recorded. Week from Friday?" "We'll have coffee on," Evelyn said, and Webb almost smiled. The formal filing happened the following week, and the week after that a copy went to Briggs's property via official county courier, which meant that Briggs now knew she had found the channel and had gone immediately to the county authority rather than filling it in and forgetting it. She had done that deliberately. She wanted him to know that she documented things. She wanted him to understand what kind of opponent he was dealing with before he made any further moves, because a man who understands his opponent's capabilities sometimes decides not to proceed, and even if Briggs didn't decide that, she wanted the record to show that she had been consistent and organized from the beginning. Briggs's response came not through the county, but directly. He appeared at the ranch again, 12 days after the filing, and this time he did not pretend it was a social call. Caleb was in the barn. She was in the house working on accounts, and she came to the door when she heard his horse and stood in the doorway and looked at him. He looked at her for a long moment from his horse. Then he dismounted. "You want to tell me what you think you're doing?" he said. "I'd ask you to come in," she said, "but I don't think this is that kind of conversation." "The channel is a natural drainage," he said. "Any surveyor worth his wage would tell you that." "Art Fenwick is worth his wage," she said, "and his report says otherwise. If you'd like to dispute it, The county water authority is the appropriate venue. You're making an enemy, he said. You don't know this valley. You don't know how things work out here. I'm learning fast, she said. He looked at her with the expression he'd had in the kitchen on his first visit, the expression of a man filing a revision. Dawson's a good enough man, he said. He's just in over his head. He's not in over his head, she said. He was being quietly undermined. There's a difference. Something shifted in Briggs's face. Not guilt. She didn't think men like Briggs experienced guilt as such, but something adjacent to exposure. The particular discomfort of someone who has operated in the assumption of not being seen and has now been seen. Caleb came out of the barn then, and Briggs turned to him with the relief of a man glad to address someone other than the person who was making him uncomfortable. Your arrangement with this woman is your business, Briggs said, but she's filing county papers against me on a bad reading of some ditch water. I read Art Fenwick's report, Caleb said. I think his reading is pretty good. Briggs was quiet for a moment. He looked between the two of them in the way a man looks when he's recalculating. What is it you want? He said finally. The question had the quality of a man who was used to being able to name a price. We want the diversion filled, Evelyn said. We want a written acknowledgement of the trespass recorded with the county, and we want first right of refusal if you ever sell your south parcel. Briggs stared at her. First right of refusal. Your south parcel borders our creek. If the property changes hands, we'd like the option to purchase it first. She kept her voice level. Those are modest terms, Mr. Briggs. The county case, if it proceeds fully, could cost you considerably more in fines and legal fees. He looked at Caleb. Is she speaking for you? She's speaking for the ranch, Caleb said. Briggs put his hat back on, which was the gesture of a man ending a conversation that hadn't gone the way he'd arrived expecting. I'll have my lawyer look at it, he said. That's reasonable, Evelyn said. Tell him to write to Crane in Pueblo. Briggs rode out. Caleb came to stand beside her, and they watched him go in the silence that followed Briggs's departure, which was different from other silences. It had the quality of air after a storm, when the pressure shifts and everything goes still and you take stock of what's still standing. First right of refusal, Caleb said. If we ever have the money, she said. Which we might, if the wheat comes in well, and the herd rebuilds the way I think it can by fall. He looked at her sideways. You think about 3 things at once. Usually more, she said, and went back inside. Charles arrived in Red Hollow on a Thursday in late March, and he did not arrive quietly. He came with 2 men. One was clearly a lawyer, in a coat that announced city money, and the other had the build and the watchful quality of someone whose job was to be useful in situations that required physical presence. They came off the afternoon train, and by the time Evelyn heard about it, she had already been told by 2 separate people, Pete's mother, who was in town that day, and Rupert Hale from the feed store, who sent his boy out on horseback with the message. She was in the south field when the boy arrived, checking the wheat, which was coming up green and strong and was going to be, by any reasonable estimate, a decent first harvest. She stood in the field and read Rupert's note twice, and then folded it and put it in her coat pocket and stood for a moment looking at the wheat. She had known this was coming. She had prepared for this. She had done everything she could think of to prepare for this, and a few things she hadn't thought of until the middle of the night and had gotten up to write down. And still, standing in the field with March wind coming off the mountains, she felt something move through her that was not quite fear but was its close neighbor, the body's memory of what it had learned to expect from that man's presence in the same space. She took a breath. Then she went to find Caleb. He was at the barn. She gave him the note. He read it and handed it back without a word, but he went inside and came out with his good coat and his hat, which meant he had already decided what the day required. I'm going into town, she said. I know, he said. So am I. She had expected to argue about this and was grateful she didn't have to. I need to go to Ruth's first, she said. I'll meet you at Crane's office. She rode to town with Pete, who did not know the full situation and did not ask, which she appreciated. She went to the dry goods store first. Ruth was behind the counter when she came in and took one look at her face and came around to the front. He's here, Ruth said. It wasn't a question. Yes. My husband's cousin is riding over from Pueblo tomorrow morning, Ruth said. He got my letter last week. She held Evelyn's gaze. I know I said don't thank me yet. I'm not thanking you yet, Evelyn said. I'm noting it. Ruth almost smiled. What do you need today? Nothing, Evelyn said. I just needed you to know he's here. Whatever he tells people starting today, you've heard mine first. Ruth nodded. Go on, she said. I'll handle this end. She met Caleb at Crane's office, and Crane was already there, which meant he'd also had word. Small towns moved news faster than telegraph when they wanted to. He looked alert and prepared in the way of a man who had been expecting this and had spent the intervening weeks getting ready for it. He's at the hotel, Crane said. His lawyer's name is Forsyth. I know him by reputation. He practices in Cincinnati and Denver both. He's good. What's his move? Caleb asked. He'll file a petition in the county court for marital abandonment. He'll argue she left without cause, that she's in the company of an unknown man in the territories, and that she's incompetent to manage her own affairs. Crane looked at Evelyn. Aldridge filed first in Ohio 2 weeks ago. Your petition is on record there. Mental and physical cruelty, abandonment by the perpetrator of violence. I have the papers. He held up a folder. That filing predates anything Forsyth does here, which matters. You're the petitioner in Ohio. He can't easily become the aggrieved party in a different court when he's the respondent in his home jurisdiction. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was wound tight. Aldridge filed, she said. He filed, Crane said, and he attached documentation. A Dr. Guerin in Cincinnati provided a sworn statement regarding 2 separate examinations, and a woman named Dora Finch, she has a last name it turns out, submitted an affidavit. Dora had done that. She sat down in the chair across from Crane's desk, not because her legs had failed her exactly, but because she needed a moment to let that land. Dora, who had pressed cold cloths into her hands and packed bread and cold chicken and looked at the floor when Charles walked by, had written down what she knew and signed her name to it. Is she all right? Evelyn said. Dora, is she? She left the Whitmore estate 3 weeks after you did, Crane said. Aldridge says she's working for a family in Columbus. She's fine. Caleb put his hand briefly on the back of her chair, not touching her, just there, the way a person places themselves near something they want to support without making it into something it wasn't ready to be yet. She noticed it without looking at him. All right, she said, and straightened. What do we do today? Charles found her. She had known he would. He was not a man who waited for things to come to him, and she had decided, after considerable thought, that she would not avoid it. Running was what she had done 8 months ago, and it had been the right choice then. Standing still was what this moment required, and she knew the difference. He came to the ranch the following morning. She had told Pete to take the horses to the north pasture for the day, which removed Pete from the situation, and she had told Caleb what she intended to do, and Caleb had said very little, and then positioned himself near the barn because he was not going to be in the house, and he was not going to be out of sight. She was standing on the porch when Charles came up the road with Forsyth and the other man, and she watched them come, and she did not move from where she was. Charles looked different outside of Cincinnati, or maybe he looked exactly the same, and she was the thing that was different. He was dressed well, because Charles was always dressed well, and he had the bearing of a man who owned the space he moved through. He had probably owned most rooms he'd ever walked into. He was very good at it. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. Evelyn, he said. His voice was the same, controlled and low, with the particular warmth of a man who performs warmth rather than feels it. You look well. Charles, she said. Forsyth stood a half step behind him with his briefcase, and the third man stayed near the horses. I'd like to talk, Charles said. Just you and me. Without... He glanced toward the barn, which told her he'd already clocked Caleb, whoever that is listening. This is my home, she said. I'll talk to you here. Something moved through his face, barely, briefly, and she recognized it. It was the expression he wore when someone declined to accommodate him in a context where accommodation was the expectation. She had spent years trying to prevent that expression from appearing and had not fully understood until this moment how much energy that had cost her. I want to help you, he said. I know things have been difficult. You hit me, she said. In the hallway, in front of Dora. I have the date in my records. Forsyth made a very slight movement. Charles did not move at all. You've been unwell, he said. The stress of our circumstances. I've been well, she said. Significantly well. I've refinanced a bank debt, documented a property crime against this ranch, filed legal papers in Ohio, and brought in a wheat crop. She looked at him steadily. That doesn't sound like a woman who's confused. Evelyn. He took one step up the porch and stopped. Come home. Whatever you think. Crane's office has your copy of the Ohio filing, she said. Aldridge is the petitioner attorney. You'll want Forsyth to review it before you make any decisions. He was very still. You filed in Ohio. 2 weeks ago. She kept her voice even. Dora gave a statement. So did Dr. Guerin. I have 3 years of dated records in my own hand. She paused. I'm not confused, Charles. I never was. You worked very hard to make me believe I was, and for a long time I believed you, and I'm telling you now that I don't believe you anymore, and I haven't for quite some time. Forsyth leaned forward and said something quiet near Charles's ear. Charles's jaw moved. This isn't over, Charles said. I know, she said. That's why we filed first. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back, and she was aware, in a way she would not have been able to articulate to anyone who hadn't lived something similar, of how different this was from every other moment she had ever looked at him. In the hallway, at the dinner table, in the carriage coming home from parties. She had always been waiting for what came next, always braced for the thing she hadn't anticipated. She was not braced now. She was simply standing on her own porch in March wind, looking at a man she had spent 8 years being afraid of, and she was not afraid. He turned and went back down the steps. She stayed where she was until they had ridden out of the yard, and the sound of horses on the road had faded, and there was only the wind and the distant sound of cattle from the north pasture, and Caleb's boots on the ground as he crossed from the barn. She sat down on the porch step then, not because anything had gone out of her, but because the adrenaline had weight when it left and she needed somewhere to put it. Caleb sat down beside her, not close, but there. They sat for a while without talking. The wheat in the south field was green and full in the morning light, and the mountains west of them were losing their snow in the upper elevations, and the creek ran where it had always run, where it belonged. You all right? Caleb asked. She thought about the question seriously, because he was asking it seriously. Yes, she said. I'm all right. That took nerve, he said. I had a lot of practice getting here, she said. He looked out at the field. The Briggs agreement came back from his lawyer, he said. He accepted the terms. She turned to look at him. All 3, he said. Fill the diversion, record the acknowledgement, first right of refusal. She exhaled slowly. It was not the sound of relief exactly. It was the sound of something that had been held under pressure finding a way to release. When did you hear? This morning, before they came. He had not told her before Charles arrived, she understood, because he had judged correctly that she needed to go into that conversation carrying only what was already in her. The county will want to schedule the fill, she said. I called Webb already, he said. Next week. She looked at the field again. The wheat moved in the wind the way all living things moved in the wind, with it, not against it, bending without breaking, which was not weakness but a specific kind of knowledge about what forces could be outlasted and what forces needed to be worked with. She had spent 8 years being bent. She was learning something different now. The court proceedings in Ohio would take months. Crane had been clear about that and realistic about the shape of it. There would be filings and responses and continuances and the particular grinding patience of legal processes that moved on their own time, regardless of how urgent the people inside them found the situation. Charles had resources, and Forsyth was competent, and it would not be clean or fast. But Aldridge had filed first. Dora had given her statement. Dr. Guerin had given his statement. The Ohio filing named specific dates and specific incidents and specific witnesses, and Charles was the respondent in the jurisdiction where he lived and where his reputation mattered most. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, almost everything. She would do her part from Colorado, affidavits, correspondence, whatever Crane and Aldridge needed from her. And she would wait, and in the meantime she would manage the ranch and bring in the wheat and finish rebuilding the herd and document the water restoration and keep her ledger and write her letters. The life she had built here was not a waiting room. It was the thing itself. Whatever came out of the Ohio courts was justice, or a version of it, and she wanted it. But this land and this work and the man sitting beside her on this porch step, that was the thing she had run toward 8 months ago without knowing it, following some instinct that the advertisement had reached in her that she hadn't been able to fully name. Honest partnership. That was what he'd asked for. She was beginning to understand it was also what she'd been asking for the whole time. The spring cattle prices are going to be better than last year, she said, because they had been sitting in the feeling long enough and she was a woman who thought better when she was moving. Rupert says the stockyards in Denver are buying again. He told me the same thing, Caleb said. If we bring in 40 head and the wheat harvest is what I think it'll be, we'll have enough to buy those 3 cows from Hale's Contact and still carry operating costs through summer. And if the court proceedings cost more than Crane projected, he said, not with worry, just with the honesty that characterized everything between them. Then we adjust, she said. We've been adjusting. He nodded once. The wind came across the field and moved through the wheat and went past them and out toward the road where Charles Vane had ridden that morning, getting smaller in the distance. He was not gone. She knew better than to think he was gone. But he was smaller than he had been, and she had done that, and the field was green and the creek ran clean, and Caleb was sitting beside her in the March morning like a man who had decided this was exactly where he was supposed to be. She supposed she had made the same decision, sometime between Cincinnati and now, without marking the exact moment. Some decisions were like that. The Ohio proceedings took 7 months, which was 4 months longer than Crane had projected, and 3 months longer than Evelyn's patience wanted to allow. And in that time she learned something about waiting that she hadn't known before, that waiting is not a passive condition. It is work. It requires the same daily discipline as planting and tending and adjusting, and the people who think it isn't work have never waited for something that genuinely mattered. Aldridge wrote every 3 weeks, sometimes more. His letters were precise and procedurally detailed, and she had learned to read them the way she read account books, looking for what the numbers meant beneath what they said. Forsyth had filed a response to the Ohio petition in April, contesting the cruelty claims and arguing abandonment. Aldridge had responded with the Guerin affidavit and Dora's statement and the first 20 pages of Evelyn's ledger, which she had copied in clean hand and mailed to him the previous November. A hearing had been scheduled for June and then postponed to August. Charles had apparently found a second doctor willing to contest Guerin's findings, which Aldridge described in neutral language that she read as controlled anger. She wrote back to Aldridge after every letter. She answered questions and provided additional dates and sent the copies of Charles's letters with her own annotations in the margins. She was not the woman who had stood in the hallway and nodded. She was the woman who had been paying attention for 8 years and had written things down, and that woman turned out to be a formidable correspondent. Meanwhile, Red Hollow continued in the way of small places, loudly in some directions and quietly in others. Charles's visit in March had not gone unnoticed, and in its aftermath the town had sorted itself in the way towns do when a situation demands a position. Ruth Ellery's influence had been real, and had operated the way real influence always operates, not through announcement, but through the gradual reshaping of how people framed what they already knew. The women who had been politely distant in the fall were not suddenly warm, because warmth is slower than opinion and more honest about its own pace. But the politeness shifted quality. It became something more like acknowledgement. She was a woman who had handled herself, and this valley was full of people who understood, even if they never said it plainly, what it meant to handle yourself in circumstances that did not cooperate. Fisk Connolly continued to be unpleasant in the way of men who have decided that unpleasantness is a strategy and have committed to it past the point where a more flexible person would have reconsidered. He made a comment in Rupert Hale's store one afternoon in April, in front of 3 other men, to the effect that women who left their husbands generally had reasons that reflected poorly on the woman. Rupert had looked at his shelves and said nothing, which told Evelyn, when she heard about it, exactly what Rupert's actual view was, which was that silence in that moment was its own answer. What she also heard was that Caleb had been in the store 2 days later and had said something to Connolly in a voice low enough that nobody else quite caught the words, and that Connolly had not made another comment of that kind in public since. She asked Caleb about it. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "Nothing that needs repeating," he said, and went back to his coffee. She let it go because some things were better left in the category of done. The wheat came in at the end of June, and it was better than decent. It was genuinely good, the kind of first harvest that told you the soil had been waiting for this longer than you'd been here to ask it. They sold 2/3 of it to the Pueblo feed store at a price that validated every calculation she had made on those early morning account sheets, and kept 1/3 for their own use and for seed. The number they cleared after costs was not dramatic. It was the number of a beginning, but a beginning was exactly what it was supposed to be. She sat with the final accounting that evening and wrote it into the ledger she had started the second month she was here. Not Caleb's original book, but her own, which now ran to 2 volumes and which contained not just the ranch's finances, but her projections, her market research, her notes from conversations with Rupert and Webb and Crane and the other ranchers she had slowly, deliberately built relationships with over the past year. She had not set out to build those relationships systematically. She had done it because she was genuinely interested in how this valley worked and who understood it and what they knew, and genuine interest had turned out to be a more effective social currency in Red Hollow than status had ever been in Cincinnati. Caleb came in from the barn and looked over her shoulder at the ledger. "We cleared enough to buy the Hale cows," he said, "and keep 6 months of operating costs in reserve," she said, "if we're careful." "When are we not careful?" he said, and she heard the dry humor in it and looked up. "I want to talk to you about something," she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, because he had learned the difference between her casual statements and the ones that meant she had been thinking about something for a while and was finally ready to say it. "There are 4 children in this town who are not in school," she said. "I've counted. Pete knows of 2 others out on the ranches past the East Ridge. That's 6 children between the ages of 7 and 12 who have no schooling because the nearest school is 12 miles away, and the family's situations don't allow that kind of daily travel." He was quiet, looking at her. "The building next to Webb's office is empty," she said. "It's been empty for 2 years. I asked Ruth about it. The county owns it. There was a plan to use it for a courthouse annex, and the plan fell through. You want to put a school in it," he said. "I want to apply for a territorial school charter," she said. "Ruth's husband is on the county board. Webb has connections with the Territorial Education Office in Denver. I've drafted a letter." She slid it across the table. He picked it up and read it. It was 3 pages and covered the student need assessment, the building proposal, the funding structure she was suggesting. A combination of county allocation, private subscription from the ranching families in the valley, and a modest fee from families who could pay. It included a proposed curriculum and a proposed teacher qualification standard and a timeline. He set it down. He looked at her across the table. "You wrote this last night," he said. "And the night before," she said. "I've been thinking about it longer." "Why didn't you tell me you were thinking about it?" She considered that honestly. "I wanted to know if it was real first," she said, "or if it was just a feeling." "Is it real?" "Yes." He looked at the letter again. 6 children now," he said. "But if the valley grows, and it's going to grow, the railroad survey from last fall says they're looking at a spur line through here in 3 years. Then there'll be more," she said. "And they'll need a school that already exists." He was quiet for a moment. "The money for the building," he said. "We don't have it." "Not yet," she said. "But if the herd rebuilds the way I think it will by fall, and if we bring in a second wheat crop next spring, and if we approach the 6 largest ranching families in the valley for subscription, I've already talked to Ruth about 3 of them, informally, and 2 of them expressed interest before I'd finished my sentence. And the third? "The third is Connolly," she said. "So I'm not counting on him." Caleb made the sound that was not quite a laugh, but in that neighborhood. "When do you want to send the letter?" "This week," she said, "before I think of reasons to wait." He nodded once. She recognized that nod. It was the one that meant he had decided. The letter went out on Friday. The response from the Territorial Education Office in Denver came back in 3 weeks, which was faster than she had expected, and it was cautiously encouraging. They were interested. They had a fund for frontier school establishment. They needed a formal site assessment and a proof of community interest showing a minimum of 8 enrolled students before they would release funding. 8 students. She had 6 children she already knew about. She spent the next 2 weekends riding out to the ranches east of the ridge, sometimes alone and sometimes with Caleb, talking to parents about the school. It was not easy conversation. Some of the families were suspicious of county involvement and territorial oversight, the way frontier people were often suspicious of anything that arrived from the direction of officialdom. Some were interested but hesitant because their children were needed for ranch work, and a school day meant a day the child wasn't helping. She listened to all of it without arguing, and then she talked about what she'd seen happen to people who grew up without education. Not in a lecture, just honestly, in the way of a woman who had watched a smart man use the trappings of education to control people who didn't have the vocabulary to name what was being done to them. One mother, a woman named Clara Stennis, whose ranch ran along the South Ridge, listened to all of it and then said, "My daughter reads already. I taught her myself. But there's nobody to teach her past what I know." "That's exactly the problem," Evelyn said. Clara Stennis enrolled her daughter and her son the same week. By the end of August, she had 11 names on her enrollment list. The letter from Aldridge that arrived in September was different from his previous letters. Not in its external form, same neat handwriting, same Cincinnati postmark, but in the first line, which dispensed with the procedural preamble he normally used and said simply, "The court has ruled." She read it standing at the post office with Deese pretending not to watch from behind his window. The Ohio court had found in her favor on the primary petition. The cruelty documentation, the ledger pages, Garen's affidavit, Dora's statement, and the corroborating testimony of 2 additional witnesses Aldridge had located, a former dinner party guest named Adelaide Marsh, and a man who had worked in the Whitmore Estates stables for 6 years, had been sufficient to establish the pattern of conduct she had described. The court had rejected Charles's counter-petition. The marriage was dissolved. She was legally free. Charles retained his property in Ohio, as she had expected. She had not asked for property, had not wanted anything of his, had wanted only the dissolution and the finding and the legal clarity of the record showing what had happened in that house. What the court had given her was more than she had dared to count on. The finding was on record in an Ohio court, public and permanent, and Charles Vane's name was attached to it in a way that no amount of subsequent charm or connection could fully erase. Aldridge added a final note at the bottom of the letter, outside the formal summary. It said, "I have been practicing law for 22 years. In that time, I have seen many women in your position. Most of them did not have your records. I hope you understand what you built over those years, even when you were building it in the dark." She folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket and walked out of the post office into the September morning, which was clear and cold and smelled of the season turning, and she stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment and let herself feel it. Not triumph. She had thought it might feel like triumph, and it didn't, quite. It felt like the lifting of something that had been resting on her for so long she had stopped noticing its weight until it was gone. It felt like the specific, quiet relief of something that was finally, after a very long time, correctly named. She rode home and told Caleb. He was sitting at the kitchen table with the morning's accounts when she came in, and he looked at her face and set the pen down. She handed him the letter. He read it in the silence that she let sit without filling, because this was a moment that did not need narration. When he finished, he set the letter on the table and looked at it for a moment. "Aldridge is a good man," he said. "He is," she said. "So is Dora Finch," he said, "for what she did." She sat down across from him. The fire in the stove made its small sounds, and the morning light came through the east window at the angle it always came through in September, and outside the south field was harvested and resting and would need to be turned before winter. "I need to write to Dora," she said. "You should," he said, "and to Aldridge. And I want to send something to Dr. Garen because he didn't have to do what he did, and I'm not sure I've thought enough about what it cost him to put his name on that document." Caleb looked at her with the particular attention that she had stopped being surprised by. The attention of a man who listened to what she actually said rather than the shape of it. "Cost him?" he said. "Charles knows people in Cincinnati," she said. "Garen still practices there. Signing an affidavit against a man like Charles is not a neutral act. He would have known that." Caleb was quiet. "People surprise you," he said, "when it matters." "Some of them," she said. She wrote 4 letters that evening, to Aldridge, to Dora, to Dr. Garen, and a shorter one to Ruth Ellery, because Ruth had positioned herself between Evelyn and the town's worst assumptions before she had any obligation to, and that deserved acknowledgement. She wrote them all the same way she wrote everything, plainly, without ornament, saying what she meant. She had never been a woman for florid language. She had only been told, for 8 years, that this was a deficiency. It was not a deficiency. It was the most precise thing about her. The territorial school charter came through in October, 2 weeks before the first frost, and the building next to Webb's office was allocated for educational use by the county board at a meeting that Ruth Ellery's husband had steered in the right direction with the particular competence of a man who understood how boards worked and how to use them. The funding commitment from Denver was modest and conditional on the first-year enrollment numbers, but it was real money, and it covered the essentials: a stove for heat, desks, a small library of materials that the territorial office sent in a crate that arrived in November smelling of Denver's different altitude. The school opened on a Monday in November with 13 students, which was two more than her enrollment list because Clara Stennis's neighbor had heard about it from Clara and sent her two oldest children without warning on the first day, which Evelyn had handled by finding two additional chairs and adjusting her lesson plan on the spot. She was not a trained teacher. She knew that. She taught the way she knew how to do things, by preparing thoroughly, being honest about what she didn't know, and paying close attention to what each student was actually struggling with rather than what she had expected them to struggle with. The two oldest children, a boy of 11 and a girl of 12, were further along in reading than she'd anticipated, and she spent the second week reorganizing her approach for them specifically so they wouldn't be bored by work that was too easy. Boredom was the enemy of retention, and she knew that from her own experience of sitting in rooms where nothing was expected of her. The girl was named Maggie Stennis, Clara's daughter, the one who already read. She had a way of asking questions that went sideways. Not the question you'd expected, but the one from a different angle that got at something the obvious question would have missed. Evelyn recognized it and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Standing at the front of a classroom in a converted county building in Red Hollow, Colorado, she felt seen in reverse, recognized across time. She thought, this is what I was at 12, and nobody thought to do anything about it. She intended to do something about it. Caleb came by the school on Fridays, which she hadn't asked him to do, and which he didn't make into a statement. He would come at the end of the day and sometimes sit in the back while she finished, and afterward they would ride home together, and she would talk about the students because she couldn't help it, and he would ask questions that told her he had been listening the previous Friday and the Friday before that. One evening in December, riding home through the first hard snow of the season, he said, Maggie Stennis's father asked me about her last week. Her father. Clara had not mentioned a husband. I thought, he works the ridgeline, Caleb said. He's gone a lot, but he heard about the school from Clara and came to see me because he didn't know how else to ask. He glanced at her. He wanted to know if Maggie was actually learning or if it was just keeping her occupied. What did you tell him? I told him to ask her at supper what she'd been working on, Caleb said, and that if he wanted a longer answer, he should ask you. She looked at him through the snow. He'll ask me? He came by the school yesterday afternoon, Caleb said, while you were in town with Webb. He looked in the window for about 10 minutes and then left. She thought about that. A man standing in December snow looking through a schoolroom window at his daughter, learning something. The private mathematics of a parent understanding that their child was going somewhere they themselves hadn't been. I'll talk to him, she said. I figured you would, Caleb said. They rode the rest of the way in the snow and the dark, and she thought about the school and the students and the list she was already building in her mind of what they would need in the spring. And she thought about Maggie Stennis's sideways questions and what it meant to be 12 years old and able to see things from a different angle in a world that mostly rewarded you for seeing things straight on. And underneath all of it, quieter than the rest, she thought about how she had arrived here 8 months after leaving Cincinnati with a bruise on her face and a bag with almost nothing in it, and a letter from a stranger who had described what he wanted with a simplicity that she had, at the time mistaken for limitation, and had since come to understand was its opposite. He had known exactly what he wanted and had said it plainly. She had not known what she wanted, not then, not in those terms. She had known what she was leaving. The destination had been blurry, abstract, a different life, a different shape of days. She had not imagined this specifically. She had not imagined the wheat or the creek or the account books or the school or the particular quality of a man who asked, "What's the play?" and meant it. You cannot imagine the specific thing before you find it. You can only know, when you find it, that it is real. The blizzard came in January, 3 days of serious snow that tested the roof of the barn and buried the Southfield fence line and kept them mostly inside for the second day when the wind made outdoor work genuinely dangerous. Pete stayed in the bunkhouse and Caleb and Evelyn managed the house, and there was something about being snowed in together that stripped the remaining formality from the way they occupied the same space. She was at the stove on the second afternoon, making soup from what they had, and she burned her hand on the pot handle. Not badly, but enough, and swore, which she didn't often do in front of him, and he came from the other side of the kitchen without being asked, and took her hand and held it under cold water from the pump, and then looked at the burn, which was a red line across 2 fingers and didn't need more than that. He held her hand in both of his for a moment longer than the burn required. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the snow was loud against the windows, and the fire was going, and the soup smelled of onions and salt pork and the ordinary substance of a life being lived. "I think you know what I want to say," he said. "I think I do," she said. "I'm not going to rush it," he said. "You've had enough of men who decided things for you." "Caleb," she said, "I am not a woman who needs to be protected from a question." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Will you marry me?" It was not dramatically phrased. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without staging, like a man who meant what he said and didn't think meaning it required decoration. She thought about the advertisement she had answered. Honest partnership, no false promises. She thought about the kitchen table in October, and the ride to Pueblo, and the porch in March and 13 students in a schoolroom in November. She thought about a man who had never once told her she was wrong without being willing to hear why she thought she was right. "Yes," she said. They were married in February in Ruth Ellery's parlor, which was the warmest room in town on short notice, by a justice of the peace named Harold Fitch, who performed the ceremony in 11 minutes because it was cold and everyone in the room was standing up. Caleb wore his least worn coat. Evelyn wore the blue dress she had brought from Cincinnati, the one she had packed because it was practical and warm, and not because it was beautiful, though it was, in its plain way, both. Ruth cried, which she had clearly not planned to do, and pressed her mouth flat when she noticed herself doing it, which made it worse, and then laughed at herself, which made it better. Pete was there, now 17 and grown 6 inches in the year she'd known him, and he stood in the back with his hat in his hands and looked like a person who was genuinely glad about something, which on Pete was a significant display of emotion. There was no party afterward. They rode home in the February cold, and Caleb made coffee and she made biscuits, and they ate at the kitchen table the same way they always did, because some things didn't require ceremony to be real, and this had already been real for a long time before the 11 minutes in Ruth's parlor made it official. The school, by the following September, had 19 students. The second wheat harvest was larger than the first, and Evelyn sold the surplus at a price that allowed them to make the first offer on Briggs's south parcel. Briggs had been quietly looking to sell since the water dispute, which told her that men who operate through patience and concealment are not always well equipped for the sustained exposure of being seen clearly. His asking price was high, and she countered lower, and they met in the middle, and she was not sure either of them felt good about it, which she took as evidence that it was a fair price. The south parcel added the creek's upstream approach to their property, which meant the water that ran through the Dawson land was now theirs from source to end, and no one would be redirecting it in the night. She walked the creek line the week after they took ownership, all of it, from the new boundary north down through the old channel Fenwick had documented, and then down through the east section and the south cottonwoods to where it turned in the direction of the old fence, and she walked it alone, not because she didn't want company, but because she wanted to do it once by herself, looking at the water moving the way it was supposed to move. She thought about her ledger pages, the ones she had carried in the lining of her bag from Cincinnati. She had given them to Aldridge, and they had served their purpose in the Ohio proceeding, and she didn't need them back. What they contained was hers, regardless of where the paper was. But she thought about the impulse that had made her write them, the stubbornness of insisting on a record, the refusal to let what was true disappear just because someone with more power than her needed it to disappear. She had not known, writing in that ledger in the middle of the night while Charles slept, that she was building anything. She had only known that she was not willing to stop knowing what she knew. That instinct, small and private and uncertain of its own purpose at the time, had turned out to be the spine of everything that came after. She stood at the south end of the creek where it turned east and listened to it move. Water does not know where it is going. It knows only the grade, the pull, the next lowest point, and it moves toward it with the single-minded patience of things that cannot be stopped, only redirected. And redirection, she had learned, is temporary. The water finds its level eventually. It always does. Dora Finch wrote back in the spring, a letter that arrived slightly crumpled as though it had been in someone's pocket before it was mailed, which told Evelyn that Dora had written it more than once, and the version she sent was the 3rd or 4th attempt. It was not a long letter. It said she was well, that her situation in Columbus was good, that she had a friend there named Vera. It said that writing the affidavit had been the right thing, and she had known it was the right thing, and had been afraid anyway, which she supposed was how most right things worked. That last line Evelyn read twice. She wrote back and told Dora about the school and about the ranch and about the creek, and she told her the case had concluded in their favor, and she told her that the bread and cold chicken she had packed for that train ride had been the last meal Evelyn ate before she started cooking for herself, and that the first thing she had learned to make on a wood stove was bread, and that she had thought of Dora every time she made it. The school needed a proper teacher by the second year. She had known this was coming and had been preparing for it. She could manage 13 students or 19 at a stretch, but the growing enrollment and the range of ages required someone whose full attention could be given to the classroom rather than divided between the classroom and the ranch. She found her through a territorial teacher's placement office in Denver. A woman named Henrietta Cross, 26 years old, trained in Illinois, who had applied to 3 frontier positions and been turned down by all 3. The reasons given being that single women were considered unsuitable for the rigors of frontier posting. Evelyn read the rejection letters when Henrietta showed them to her at the initial interview and felt something she recognized as familiar in a way that made her jaw tighten. "What do they think a frontier posting requires that a single woman can't provide?" she asked. "They don't say specifically," Henrietta said. "They rarely do." "Can you teach mathematics to a 12-year-old who already thinks sideways?" Henrietta considered the question. "Better than I can teach it to one who thinks straight," she said. Evelyn hired her on the spot. Henrietta was not easy to live with in the initial months, which was fine because she didn't live at the ranch. She boarded with Ruth Ellery, who had a spare room and who, Evelyn suspected, enjoyed having another woman in the house who talked back. Henrietta was opinionated and occasionally stubborn, and had a way of being right about things that could be grating when you were also right about the same things, and had gotten there first, which Evelyn found she could manage by remembering that being right and being useful were not always the same category, and that the school needed Henrietta's particular way of being right in the classroom more than it needed Evelyn's pride about timing. By the end of Henrietta's first year, Maggie Stennis was doing mathematics 2 years above her age level. Her father had come to the school that spring for the end-of-year demonstration Henrietta had organized, where each student presented something they had made or solved or written. He sat in the 3rd row and watched his daughter stand at the front of the room and explain, without notes, how she had calculated the area of their south pasture using measurements she'd taken herself with the length of rope and the knowledge that a right triangle's area was half the product of its legs. He did not say much afterward. He shook Henrietta's hand and he shook Evelyn's hand, and his face had the compressed quality of a man who was not going to cry in public but was working hard on it. He said, "I didn't know she could do that." "She could always do it," Evelyn said. "She just needed somewhere to practice." The letter from Charles came 2 years after the dissolution, which was long enough that she had stopped expecting one, and short enough that it was not entirely a surprise. It was formal and brief, and had been written, she thought, with the assistance of a lawyer, because it used that careful passive voice construction that lawyers preferred when they were trying to convey something without actually saying it. It said that he was prepared to make no further claims related to the marriage or its dissolution, and that he hoped she was well. She read it in the kitchen in the morning and then set it aside and ate her breakfast and thought about it while she did the accounts. She did not hate him. She had expected to hate him, and she didn't, not exactly. What she felt when she thought about Charles Vane was something more like the feeling you have toward weather that has passed. It had been real. It had done damage. It was gone now. Hating weather seemed like misdirected energy. What the weather had done was teach her what she was capable of surviving, and surviving was what she'd done, and the surviving had brought her here. She wrote back, one paragraph carefully drafted, acknowledging receipt of his letter and wishing him the same. She meant the last part genuinely, because she had found that she did not want him to suffer specifically. She only wanted him to be somewhere she wasn't. That distinction felt important. It felt like the difference between holding on to something and letting it finish. She sent the letter and did not think about Charles Vane again in any sustained way, which was itself a kind of final answer to a question she had been living inside for years. 4 years after Evelyn Hart arrived on a westbound train with a bag and a bruise and a letter from a stranger, The Dawson Ranch was not the same place that Caleb had been running alone through 2 bad winters and a man's patient theft of its water. It was not dramatic in the way of things in stories. There was no moment when suddenly everything was large and successful and the future declared itself in obvious terms. It was quieter than that. It was the accumulation of decisions made correctly over time, of accounts kept honestly, of relationships built without shortcuts, of work done in the mornings before the day announced its intentions. The herd was 93 head and climbing. The wheat field had doubled in the 3rd year when they broke additional ground on the former Briggs parcel. The school had a proper building, not the converted county office anymore, but a structure built specifically for the purpose, paid for through a combination of the territorial grant, the ranching family's subscription fund, and a contribution from the Dawson Ranch that Evelyn and Caleb had argued about for exactly one evening before she showed him the numbers, and he said, "All right." There was an evening that October, after the 3rd harvest was in and the accounts were squared and Henrietta had started the new school year with 23 students, when Evelyn walked out to the edge of the south field alone at dusk and stood there in the cooling air looking at the land. She was 34 years old. She had been in Red Hollow for 4 years. She had been so many versions of herself in those 4 years. The frightened woman on the train, the woman with blistered hands learning a wood stove, the woman sitting across from Crane with her ledger pages, the woman on the porch watching Charles Vane get smaller as he rode away, the woman in Ruth's parlor in a blue dress saying yes to 11 minutes and a lifetime. None of those versions had been complete. None of them had been the whole of her. They were all still in there, layered, the way a place shows its history and its ground. The old creek bed under the new channel, the roots of last year's wheat decomposing to feed this year's, the marks of the shovel in the diversion channel still faintly visible under the new growth, if you knew where to look. She had not escaped her past. You do not escape a past. You carry it differently over time if you are lucky and deliberate, and the weight of it changes shape without ever fully going away, and eventually you stop being surprised by that and start working with it instead. She thought about what it had taken. Not the dramatic moments, not the porch in March, or the courtroom finding, or the school's opening day, but the small daily decisions that nobody witnessed. Getting up at 5 when she didn't feel like it. Writing one more letter to Aldridge when she was tired. Riding out to see Webb again when the water filing stalled. Sitting with a frightened 12-year-old who thought she was bad at reading and spending the extra hour to find out that she wasn't bad at reading, she just needed a different approach. Those were the things. The unseeable, unspectacular, accumulating things that don't look like courage in the moment and only reveal themselves as such in retrospect, when you stand somewhere you couldn't have imagined standing and you look back and try to trace the line that brought you here. Caleb came out and stood beside her. He didn't say anything because they had been together long enough that he could read when something was not a conversation. She leaned slightly into his shoulder. He was solid and warm and smelled of the barn and the autumn air. "The Fenwick boy asked me today if we'd need extra help come spring," he said eventually. He had a way of entering conversations sideways, which she had always appreciated. "The Fenwick boy is 12, she said. "He's big for 12, Caleb said, "and he wants to learn the accounts." She looked at the field, the dark soil, the harvested stubble, the fence line running south toward the parcel they now owned all the way to the creek's origin, the mountains in the last light, the school's roofline visible from here if you knew where to look. "Tell him to come by on Saturday," she said. "I'll start him with the basics." Caleb made the sound that was almost a laugh. "You know he'll be running the books inside of a year." "Good," she said. "I have other things to think about." They stood there as the light finished going and the first stars came out, and the creek made its sound in the dark. Steady and purposeful and entirely itself, moving toward where it was supposed to go. She had arrived here looking for a way to survive. She had not known, boarding that westbound train with her small bag and her hidden ledger pages and her borrowed courage, that survival was only the beginning. That what came after survival, if you stayed in it long enough and paid enough attention and refused often enough to go back to being smaller than you actually were, what came after was this. Not perfect, not finished, not without its losses and its difficulties, and the ordinary grinding work of keeping something alive through seasons that didn't care whether you wanted them to be easier. But hers. Fully and undeniably and permanently hers. She had built it herself, In the mornings before anyone was watching, in the letters she wrote, and the accounts she kept, and the questions she asked, and the ground she refused to give. Nobody could take that. Not Charles Vane with his lawyers and his story. Not Harlan Briggs with his patient diversion. Not the winter that killed cattle, or the markets that dropped prices, or the people who looked at a woman off a train from Cincinnati and decided they knew what she was. What she was had always been hers to define. It had taken her a long time to understand that. She understood it now.